What would you do if your entire world shattered in a single second, not by a natural disaster, but by a silent notification on a screen? Imagine standing in a beautiful kitchen, 8 months pregnant, baking a cake for the husband you built an empire with, only to uncover an audio message of him calling you repulsive and planning to throw you away the moment his big corporate merger closes. This is the brutal reality Clara faced. But her husband made one fatal mistake. He mistook her silence for weakness. He had no idea that her quiet, devastating silence was actually a calculated trap. And he certainly didn't know that Clara's simple, country-born father was actually the shadow billionaire who owned the very ground his empire was built upon. Today, we reveal a gripping story of how a masterclass in deception turned into a surgical strike of absolute justice. This story is a powerful reminder that true strength doesn't need to scream, and those who build their success on arrogance, greed, and the betrayal of the ones who loved them during their darkest days will ultimately watch their empires crumble into dust. If you are ready to see how a broken heart transformed into unbreakable steel, please hit that like button right now. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever seen karma hit someone this perfectly? Share this story with someone who needs an inspiring reminder of their own worth. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss another deeply moving narrative.
The heavy metal whisk clinked against the edge of the glass mixing bowl. Clink, clink, clink. Clara stopped stirring. She placed the whisk on the counter and pressed a flour-covered hand against her lower back. A dull, heavy ache radiated from her spine, down to her hips. She closed her eyes and took a slow, deep breath. She was exactly 8 months pregnant. 32 weeks and 4 days. Her ankles were swollen tight against her socks. Her feet felt bruised, like they belonged to someone else entirely. The air conditioning in the massive kitchen was set to 68 degrees, but a thin layer of sweat still coated her forehead. The kitchen smelled of pure vanilla extract and lemon zest. The massive double ovens radiated a steady, comforting heat against her legs. Clara opened her eyes and looked down at the pale yellow batter resting in the bowl. Tomorrow was the biggest night of her husband's life. Vance was hosting a private gala to celebrate the impending merger of his tech and real estate empire with Apex Holdings. 500 guests were expected at the downtown ballroom. Governors, senators, and tech billionaires. But Clara wanted to give him something personal tonight, just the two of them. A simple lemon pound cake. It was the exact same cake she used to bake for him 7 years ago, back when they shared a cramped, one-bedroom apartment in Seattle. Back when Vance was just a frantic young man with a laptop, a dream, and a mountain of credit card debt. Clara had worked double shifts at the hospital to keep their lights on. She smiled softly at the memory. The baby shifted inside her, delivering a sharp kick to her ribs. "I know, little one," Clara whispered to the empty room. "Mommy needs to sit down too. Almost done." She reached out to grab her phone to check the recipe for the lemon glaze. The screen was black. Dead battery. Clara sighed. She looked across the cold, white marble of the kitchen island. Van's iPad Pro was sitting near the fruit bowl, encased in its sleek leather cover. This was highly unusual. Vance never went anywhere without his devices. He was obsessed with being connected, but he had been rushing frantically that morning. He was barking orders into his headset about zoning laws and board seats, barely kissing her cheek before sprinting out the door to his waiting driver. Clara wiped her hands on her apron. She walked around the massive island. Her slippers shuffled softly against the imported Italian tile. She reached out and tapped the dark screen of the iPad to wake it up. Instantly, a bright notification banner slid down from the top of the glass. The device let out a soft, melodic chime. It was a text message from Peyton Croft. Clara paused. Her finger hovered just an inch above the screen. Peyton was Vance's executive assistant. She was 27 years old. She wore designer suits, walked with absolute perfect posture, and always looked at Clara with a strange, polite smile. a smile that never quite reached her eyes. Clara had always felt a subtle, lingering discomfort around Peyton, but she always pushed the feeling down. She told herself she was just being insecure. Peyton was efficient. Vance needed efficient people. The message on the screen was partially hidden, but Clara could see the first few words. I can't stop thinking about the hotel. Clara stared at the glowing white text. The air in the kitchen suddenly felt very still. The hum of the refrigerator seemed to fade away. That is not a message for a boss. Clara's chest tightened. A cold prickle of adrenaline washed over her shoulders. She told herself to walk away. She told herself not to look. But her hand moved on its own. She swiped her finger across the screen. The iPad was unlocked. Vance had removed the passcode last week because he said it was slowing him down during meetings. The messaging app opened instantly. It filled the large screen. Clara stopped breathing. The screen was a wall of blue and gray text bubbles, hundreds of them, sent at 2 in the morning, sent during board meetings, sent while Vance was supposed to be at the gym. Clara's eyes darted across the words. Peyton, did she believe you about the Dallas trip? Vance, of course. She never asked questions. I miss you last night was incredible, Peyton. The necklace you bought me is stunning, but I want you, not just gifts. When is this going to end? Vance? I am tired of waiting. Clara gripped the edge of the marble island. The stone was freezing against her warm skin. Her legs suddenly felt like they were made of water. I am reading a script. This is not real. This is a mistake. Her internal voice was flat, emotionless, trying to process a threat that was too large to comprehend. She scrolled up with a shaking finger. The messages went back months, 6 months, 7 months. They had been sleeping together since the day Clara found out she was pregnant. Her vision blurred. The edges of the kitchen began to darken. A high-pitched ringing sound started in her left ear. Then she saw something else. At the very bottom of the screen, sent just 3 minutes ago, it was an audio file from Vance to Peyton. Clara stared at the little play button. It was a tiny blue triangle. It looked like a weapon. If I press this, my life is over. She pressed it. The volume on the iPad was turned all the way up. Vance's voice blasted into the quiet kitchen. Crystal clear, he sounded annoyed. He sounded tired. God, Peyton, you have to be patient. You have no idea what it is like for me right now. Walking into this house every day is suffocating. Clara stopped breathing. She is enormous, Vance, as voice continued. The cruelty in his tone was casual, effortless, like a whale. She just waddles around the house in these massive sweatpants, complaining about her back. It is completely repulsive. I don't even want to look at her. Clara took a step backward. Her hip bumped hard against the counter. I cannot wait until this kid pops out, the recording went on. I am doing the bare minimum until the ink dries on the Apex merger. The board needs to see the stable family man. Once the deal is public, I am cutting her a massive check and shipping her to a house in the suburbs. Peyton, you are the future of this brand, not her. She is just a boring housewife. Just smile through the gala tomorrow. Book the hotel for us on Friday. The usual suite. I love you. The audio message ended. The screen went dark. The quiet returned to the kitchen. But it was not a peaceful quiet. It was a violent, ringing silence. Clara's hands began to tremble. A violent, uncontrollable shaking that started in her wrists and traveled all the way up to her shoulders. He hates me. He thinks I am repulsive. She looked down at her body, her large, swollen belly, the body that was growing his child, the body that had stretched and ached and suffered for 8 months to give him the family he begged for. He called her a whale. To his 27-year-old assistant, Clara backed away from the island. She could not get enough air into her lungs. The smell of vanilla suddenly made her stomach heave. The heat from the oven felt like it was burning her skin. She turned blindly toward the counter. Her shaking hand caught the edge of the heavy glass mixing bowl. She tried to grab it. Her fingers slipped on the smooth glass. The bowl tipped over the edge of the counter. It fell in slow motion. It hit the hard Italian tile. The sound was explosive, a sharp, violent shatter that echoed off the high ceilings. Glass exploded outward in 100 jagged pieces. Pale yellow cake batter splattered across the white cabinets, across the stainless steel dishwasher, and across Clara's bare ankles. Clara stood frozen. She stared at the wreckage on the floor. It was ruined, all of it. Her, her mind fractured. The trauma was too immense to absorb all at once. Her brain desperately tried to find something small to focus on. Something she could control. The mess. She needed to clean up the mess. Vance hated messes. Clara slowly sank to her knees. The thick, wet cake batter soaked instantly into the fabric of her sweatpants. She didn't care. She reached out with her bare hands and began picking up the jagged shards of glass. Her breathing was shallow and fast. In, out, in, out. She placed a large piece of glass onto the counter. She reached for another. I have to clean this up. I have to clean the floor. She reached for a smaller, sharper piece. Her finger slipped. The sharp edge sliced deep into the pad of her index finger. Clara pulled her hand back. A bright bead of red blood swelled to the surface. It dripped down, landing perfectly in a puddle of yellow batter. She stared at the blood. She felt absolutely zero pain. Her body was completely numb. She wiped her bloody finger on her apron. She kept picking up the glass, piece by piece. When the large shards were on the counter, she grabbed a roll of paper towels. She ripped off 5 sheets. She began scrubbing the floor, wiping up the batter. Over and over, she wiped the same spot on the tile until her knuckles turned white. He is having an affair. He is leaving me. She scrubbed harder. He called me repulsive. She scrubbed until the paper towel tore into wet shreds. Clara dropped the ruined paper towels. She sat back on her heels, right in the middle of the kitchen floor. She wrapped both of her arms tightly around her pregnant belly. She pulled her knees up as far as they could go. She rocked back and forth, just a little bit. Then, the compulsion hit her. She had to hear it again. She had to make sure she didn't imagine it. Clara forced herself to stand up. Her joints popped. Her back screamed in agony. She walked back to the island. Her bloody finger left a small red smudge on the leather iPad case. She tapped the screen. She hit the blue triangle. Vance's voice filled the room again. Enormous, like a whale, she just waddles around. She locked the screen. The screen went black. She stood there for 10 seconds. She unlocked the screen. She hit play. Repulsive. I don't even want to look at her. She locked the screen. Black, unlocked, play. Shipping her to a house in the suburbs. Lock, black. Unlock, play. I love you. Clara locked the device for the final time. She shoved the iPad away from her. It slid across the marble and hit the fruit bowl with a dull thud. I am not crazy. I know what I heard. The denial was gone. The shock was hardening into a cold, terrifying reality. She was 31 years old. She was 8 months pregnant. She had quit her job as a pediatric nurse 3 years ago because Vance wanted her to travel with him. She had no independent income. Her name was not on the deed to this house. It was not on the bank accounts. Vance had restructured everything into a blind trust last year. He told her it was for tax purposes. He lied. He was preparing to throw her away. Clara walked over to the kitchen sink. She turned on the cold water. The pressure was high. The water blasted against the stainless steel basin. She thrust her hands under the freezing stream. She watched the water turn pink as it washed the blood from her cut finger. She reached for the soap dispenser. 1 pump, 2 pumps, 3 pumps. She scrubbed her hands together. The foam turned slightly pink. She rinsed. She reached for the soap again. 1, 2, 3. Scrub, rinse. She stared out the large window above the sink. The window looked out over the massive manicured front lawn. The sky was turning a soft bruised purple. As the afternoon faded into evening, she was trapped. Vance held all the cards. If she confronted him right now, he would deny it. He would gaslight her. He would tell her she was being hormonal and crazy. If she pushed it, he would lock her out. He had the best lawyers in the state on retainer. He would take the baby. He would destroy her in court. I have nothing, the words echoed in her mind. It was a terrifying fact. She dried her hands on a clean towel. The cut on her finger had stopped bleeding. Suddenly, a low mechanical rumble vibrated through the floorboards. Clara froze. It was the sound of the massive garage doors opening. Vance was home. Clara looked at the clock on the stove. It was 4:30 in the afternoon. He was never home this early. Never. Panic seized her chest. She looked at the iPad on the island. She had left his messages open. She lunged toward the island. She grabbed the iPad. Her fingers fumbled with the screen. She swiped up. She closed the messaging app. She hit the power button, plunging the screen into darkness. She placed it exactly where it had been sitting. She looked around the kitchen. The broken glass was piled on the counter. The floor was still sticky with lemon batter. Her sweatpants were stained yellow. She heard the heavy thud of a car door closing in the garage. Then, the sound of his footsteps. Confident, heavy, moving up the short staircase toward the kitchen door. Clara took a deep breath. She forced her shoulders to drop. She forced her hands to stop shaking. She grabbed a clean rag and began wiping the counter, pretending to be perfectly fine. The brass handle of the kitchen door clicked. The door swung open. Vance stepped into the room. He looked perfect. His dark hair was styled immaculately. He was wearing a navy blue tailored suit that cost more than Clara's first car. He was holding his leather briefcase in one hand and talking loudly into his wireless earpiece. "I do not care what the zoning board says, David." Vance barked into the empty air. "Double the offer. Buy the land. Call me back when it is done." He tapped his ear, ending the call. He let out a heavy sigh and dropped his briefcase onto a nearby chair. He finally looked up and saw Clara. His eyes scanned the room. He saw the broken glass. He saw the batter on the floor. He saw her stained clothes. "What happened in here?" he asked. His voice was smooth. "Normal." Clara stared at him. She looked at his lips, the same lips that had just called her a whale, the same lips that had told another woman he loved her. "I dropped a bowl," Clara said. Her voice sounded hollow. Vance sighed again, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Jesus, Clara, be careful. You are going to slip and hurt yourself. Where is Maria? Why isn't the housekeeper cleaning this up?" "Maria went home at 3, Clara replied evenly. Vance shook his head. He walked across the room toward her. As he got closer, Clara could smell him. Expensive cedar cologne. And underneath it, something else. Something floral, something sweet. Peyton's perfume. Vance stopped right in front of her. He reached out and placed his large, warm hand directly onto her pregnant belly. Clara's skin crawled. Every instinct in her body screamed to slap his hand away, to scream, to throw the broken glass at his face. Instead, she stood perfectly still. Vance leaned in. He pressed his lips against her forehead. "How are you feeling, sweetheart?" he asked softly. Clara looked directly into his dark eyes. He was looking at her with total, flawless affection. It was a masterclass in deception. He is a monster. Clara forced the corners of her mouth to turn upward. She gave him a small, quiet smile. "I am fine, Vance," Clara said. "I am just fine." Vance pulled away from her forehead. He smiled, a perfectly practiced expression that crinkled the corners of his eyes just right. "Go upstairs and change," Vance said. "You look exhausted. Leave the mess for Maria tomorrow." "I will order some dinner. You need to rest before the gala." He patted her shoulder and walked past her, heading straight for the liquor cabinet in the living room. Clara stood frozen in the kitchen. She listened to the clink of crystal glasses, the sound of heavy amber liquid pouring over ice. She turned and walked slowly toward the stairs. Each step felt like lifting 50 pounds. Her wet sweatpants clung to her calves. The smell of sweet cake batter and sour betrayal made her throat tight. She walked into their massive master bathroom. The floors were heated white marble. The walls were lined with floor-to-ceiling mirrors. Clara avoided her own reflection. She did not want to see the woman who had been so easily fooled. She peeled off her sticky clothes and dropped them into the hamper. She stepped into the glass shower enclosure and turned the brass handle. The hot water blasted over her shoulders. It stung her skin. Clara leaned her forehead against the cold glass wall. She closed her eyes. She scrubbed her skin with lavender soap. She scrubbed her neck. She scrubbed her arms. She scrubbed the spot on her forehead where his lips had just touched her. She rubbed the skin until it turned angry and red. She felt contaminated. The raw pain of recognition washed over her, heavier than the water. She was married to a stranger, the man she fell in love with, the man who used to split a single slice of cheap pizza with her in a freezing apartment, was completely gone. He had been replaced by this polished, cruel imposter. Clara turned off the water. She wrapped a thick towel around her body. She walked into the bedroom. The air conditioning kicked on with a low hum. She put on a clean, oversized cotton shirt and a pair of loose fleece pants. She walked downstairs. The house was quiet, too quiet. She found Vance sitting at the long mahogany dining table. The table was large enough to seat 12 people. He was sitting at the head of it. He was wearing his crisp white dress shirt, but he had loosened his expensive silk tie. There were two white paper bags from a high-end restaurant sitting on the table. Clara pulled out a heavy wooden chair and sat down at the opposite end of the table. The distance between them felt like a massive canyon. Vance opened the bags and pulled out several black plastic containers. He popped the lids off. The strong, pungent smell of raw tuna and soy sauce hit Clara's nose. It was sushi. Clara stared at the raw fish. She swallowed hard, her stomach churned. "I got the spicy tuna rolls you used to like," Vance said, not looking up from his phone. "And the salmon sashimi." Clara remained completely silent. Dust. She was 32 weeks pregnant. She had not eaten raw fish in 8 months. Her doctor had forbidden it. Vance had sat right next to her in the sterile clinic room. When the doctor handed them the dietary restriction list, he did not just forget. He simply did not care. She was completely erased from his daily reality. "I cannot eat raw fish, Vance," Clara said quietly. Vance stopped typing. He looked up. A flash of genuine annoyance crossed his face. "Right," he said, sighing heavily. "The pregnancy rules. I forgot. There is some steamed rice in the bottom container. Just eat that." He went back to his phone. Clara reached for the container of plain white rice. She scooped a small portion onto her porcelain plate. She picked up her silver fork. The silence in the dining room was suffocating. The only sounds were the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the rhythmic tapping of Vance's thumbs against his glass screen. Tap, tap, tap. Clara slowly chewed a mouthful of dry rice. It tasted like sand. She watched her husband. He was staring intensely at his phone. Suddenly, a slow, lazy smirk spread across his face. He shifted in his chair, leaning back, looking entirely satisfied. He typed a quick reply. He set the phone down next to his plate, face down. Clara felt a sharp, burning ache in her chest. The pain was so intense it stole her breath. She knew exactly who he was texting. She knew what Peyton had just said to make him smile like that. They were laughing at her. They were planning their weekend at the luxury hotel. Every smile he gave her now felt like a blade twisting in her chest. "The gala is going to be massive tomorrow," Vance said suddenly, cutting through the silence. He picked up a piece of salmon with his chopsticks. "The entire board from Apex Holdings is flying in. I need you to wear the blue silk dress." "The blue dress does not fit me anymore," Clara replied. Her voice was surprisingly steady. "Make it fit," Vance snapped. His tone was sharp, devoid of the gentle affection he had faked in the kitchen. "I need the optics to be perfect. The Apex executives are old school. They value family stability. They need to see the devoted pregnant wife standing by my side. It seals the narrative." He took a bite of his food. He did not even look at her as he spoke. "I am a prop to him," Clara thought. "I am just a piece of furniture for his stage. I will find something appropriate to wear," Clara said. "Make sure you do," Vance replied. "And please, Clara, try to look happy. You have been walking around this house looking miserable for weeks. It is exhausting." The sheer audacity of his words hit her like a physical blow. He was suffocating her, draining the life out of her, and then complaining that she looked pale. Clara set her silver fork down on the porcelain plate. It made a sharp, metallic clink. "I am going to bed," Clara said. She stood up. Her back screamed in protest. "Good idea," Vance said, already picking up his phone again. "I have more work to do. I will sleep in the guest room tonight. I do not want to wake you." "You do not want to sleep next to the whale," Clara thought. "Good night, Vance," she said. She turned and walked away. She did not look back. Clara climbed the stairs and walked into the master bedroom. She shut the heavy wooden door behind her. She did not turn on the overhead lights. The room was bathed in the pale, silver glow of the moon shining through the large windows. She walked over to her nightstand. She picked up her own smartphone. She sat heavily on the edge of the large California king bed. The mattress was cold. She unlocked her phone. She opened the family tracking application. Vance had installed it a year ago for safety reasons. She clicked on Vance's profile. The map loaded onto the screen. She looked at his location history for the day. At 3 o'clock that afternoon, his phone had not been at the corporate office. The little blue dot was hovering over the Grand Marquis Hotel downtown. Clara stared at the dot. She locked the screen. The phone went black. She unlocked it. She looked at the blue dot again. The Grand Marquis Hotel. She locked the screen. Black, she unlocked it a third time. The dot had not moved. 3 times. Lock, unlock, lock, unlock, lock. The routine of checking, of confirming her own trauma was entirely paralyzing. Clara tossed the phone onto the empty pillow beside her. She pulled her knees up, resting her arms on her pregnant belly. The baby kicked gently against her palm. A tiny, fragile flutter of life in a house filled with death. She stared into the dark corners of the large bedroom. Her inner voice was no longer frantic. It was slow, cold, and absolute. I deserve better than this. She let the statement hang in the quiet room. She did not question it. She did not wonder if she could have been a better wife, or if she should have lost weight, or if she should have worn more makeup. I gave him everything. I built the foundation he stands on, and somewhere along the way, I became completely invisible. The tears finally came, but they were not loud, gasping sobs. They were silent, heavy tears that spilled over her eyelashes and rolled down her cheeks, soaking into the collar of her cotton shirt. She sat there in the dark for a long time. The house settled around her. The floorboards creaked. Outside, a light wind rattled the branches of the large oak tree against the window pane. The sadness began to ebb away, like a tide pulling back from the shore, and in its place a new emotion began to pool in the pit of her stomach. It was sharp, it was focused, she needed to know everything. If Vance was planning to blindside her after the merger, he would have prepared for it, He would have hidden assets, he would have moved money. Clara wiped her face with the back of her hand. The skin was rough and dry. She reached under the bed and pulled out her silver laptop. She opened the lid. The bright, harsh light illuminated her face in the dark room. She typed in her password. The desktop loaded. Clara knew Vance was careless with technology when he felt untouchable. He had linked all his personal devices to the same cloud storage account years ago. He thought Clara was too technologically inept to ever check it. She opened the web browser. She navigated to the shared family drive. She clicked on a folder labeled Personal Backup. The folder opened. It contained thousands of image files, automatically synced from his phone. Clara's hand trembled slightly as she moved the mouse. She clicked on the first image thumbnail to expand it. The picture loaded. It was Peyton. She was standing on the deck of Vance's luxury yacht. She was wearing a white bikini. She was holding a glass of champagne. The sun was shining on her blonde hair. Clara clicked the next arrow. Another picture of Peyton, this time sitting in a high-end restaurant, smiling over a plate of oysters. Clara clicked again and again and again. A digital timeline of an entirely separate life. Vacations she was never told about. Dinners she was never invited to. Gifts bought with money she had helped him earn. Then she clicked to the next image. Clara stopped breathing. The image was a close-up shot. It was Peyton's left hand, resting casually on a white linen tablecloth. Wrapped around Peyton's index finger was a ring. It was not a new ring. It was vintage. The center stone was a massive deep blue sapphire, surrounded by a halo of antique, rose-cut diamonds. The gold band was slightly worn at the edges from decades of use. Clara felt the blood drain completely from her face. She zoomed in on the photo. The pixels blurred slightly, but the details were undeniable. It was her grandmother's sapphire ring, the ring her mother had passed down to her on her wedding day. The ring she kept safely tucked away in a velvet box in her jewelry drawer. Vance had not just bought his mistress a gift. He had stolen Clara's history to give to her. Clara pushed the laptop away. She stood up, her vision tunneled. She walked toward the large walk-in closet at the back of the bedroom. She turned on the bright overhead lights. She pulled open the top drawer of the custom wooden dresser. She shoved her silk scarves aside. She reached for the back corner. Her fingers brushed against the familiar, soft velvet of the small black box. Clara pulled the box out. It felt incredibly light. She popped the little metal hinge open. Tossed. The white satin interior was perfectly clean and completely empty. Snap, the small metal hinge of the velvet box clicked shut. The sharp sound echoed against the rows of wooden shelves in the massive walk-in closet. Clara catch closet. She does not try to catch herself. She slid down the smooth wooden drawers. She hit the plush carpet with a heavy thud. She sat in the dark. The only light was a thin yellow strip bleeding under the closet door. The empty box rested in her lap. Her thumb traced the worn edges of the black velvet. He did not just break her heart. He erased her history. The sapphire ring was over 80 years old. Just. Her grandfather had bought it for her grandmother after the war. Her mother had worn it every day of her life. It smelled like old rose perfume and polished brass. It was the only tangible piece of her family she had left. Taunt. And Vance had slipped it onto the finger of a 27-year-old girl. A girl who probably thought it was just a quirky vintage piece from an antique shop. Clara closed her eyes. The darkness behind her eyelids offered no relief. The memories came rushing in, a violent flood of images she could not stop. Just. She remembered the winter of 2015. They were living in a tiny apartment in Seattle. The heating unit was broken. The windows rattled every time the wind blew. The apartment always smelled like damp wood and cheap instant coffee. Vance had been working on the original source code for his real estate algorithm. He worked at a small plastic folding table. He wore 3 layers of sweaters. Clara had been working double shifts at the pediatric ward. Her feet would bleed inside her cheap white sneakers. But she never complained, because when she came home, Vance would massage her feet. He would look at her with such intense, desperate love. "I am going to give you the world, Clara," he used to whisper in the dark. "Just hold on. I will build an empire for us." She remembered the night they almost got evicted. The red notice was taped to their door. Vance had cried. It was the only time she ever saw him cry. Clara had gone to her jewelry box. She pulled out the sapphire ring. She told him they could pawn it. It would cover 3 months of rent. Vance had pushed her hand away. He looked horrified. "Never," he had said, his voice fierce. "That is your family. That is sacred. I would rather sleep on the street than sell your history." Clara opened her eyes. The dark closet slowly came back into focus. The memory felt like a physical poison in her veins. It was tainted. Everything was tainted. The man who called her ring sacred was dead. The man who kissed her bleeding feet was dead. She was grieving a ghost. The ache of the lost years settled heavily in her chest. She had traded her youth, her career, and her body to build a pedestal for a man who used it to look down on her. Clara forced herself to stand. Her swollen ankles throbbed with a dull, steady rhythm. She walked out of the closet. She crossed the bedroom and entered the master bathroom. She did not reach for the light switch. The moonlight filtered through the frosted glass window. It cast long, gray shadows across the floor. Clara walked to the massive porcelain bathtub. She sat down on the cold edge. She was fully clothed in her gray fleece pants and oversized cotton shirt. She stared down at the expensive white tiles. She reached out her right hand. She pressed her index finger against the cold floor. She began to trace the straight, deep grout lines between the tiles. Down, across, down, across. The porcelain was freezing against her skin. The bathroom smelled faintly of lavender soap and damp towels. She did not cry. She did not move. She just traced the lines. For 3 full minutes, the house was entirely silent. The only sound was the steady, rhythmic pull of oxygen entering and leaving her lungs. In, out, in, out. It was a small, mindless action, but it anchored her to the earth. It stopped the room from spinning. She stared at the silver drain in the center of the tub. Just. Her mind processed the terrifying reality of her situation. She was entirely dependent on a man who despised her. She had no savings of her own. Her nursing license had expired 2 years ago. She had a baby arriving in less than 8 weeks. She had to choose between her dignity and her security. Both felt impossible to lose when there was a baby on the way. If she confronted him now, without a plan, she would lose everything. Vance would lock her out of the accounts. He would hire a vicious legal team. He would paint her as an unstable, hormonal woman. He would take custody of their daughter just to punish Clara for ruining his public image. But if she stayed, if she smiled at the gala tomorrow, she would lose her soul. Clara pulled her hand away from the floor. She sat up straight. She looked at her pale reflection in the large bathroom mirror. The validation whisper came to her. It was not a question. It was a solid, undeniable fact. The hardest part is admitting I knew all along. She spoke the words out loud to the empty room. Her voice was raspy, but firm. She had known. Taunt. She had seen the signs for over a year. The sudden password changes on his phone. The late nights at the office that never yielded any new contracts. The way he stopped looking her in the eyes when they spoke. The sudden cruel jokes about her weight when the pregnancy began. She had ignored her own instincts. She had chosen comfortable blindness over painful truth. I was being gaslit the whole time. The realization did not break her. Strangely, it fortified her. The confusion evaporated. The fog of self-doubt lifted entirely. She was not crazy. She was the victim of a calculated, prolonged deception. And the deception was not just about sex. It was about power. It was about money. Clara stood up from the bathtub. The cold porcelain released her. She walked back into the bedroom. The digital clock on the nightstand glowed with red numbers. It was 2:15 in the morning. Vance was asleep in the guest bedroom down the hall. He was likely dreaming about his merger. Dreaming about the massive payout. Dreaming about Peyton. Clara walked over to her laptop. It was still open on the bed. The picture of Peyton wearing the stolen ring was still glowing on the screen. Clara reached out and closed the picture tab. She was done looking at the affair. The affair was just a symptom. The disease was the finances. If Vance was planning to abandon her, he would not leave his money unprotected. He was too greedy for that. He was a man who calculated every single penny. She opened a new browser window. She navigated to the login page of their primary joint banking account. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. She typed in her username. She typed in her password. She hit the enter key. A red error message flashed across the screen. Incorrect password. Please try again. Clara frowned. She deleted the text and typed it again, slower, this time, making sure every letter was correct. Enter. Incorrect password. You have one attempt remaining before account lockout. A cold spike of adrenaline hit her chest. Vance had changed the password to the joint account, the account that held the money for the mortgage, the groceries, and the baby's nursery furniture. He had locked her out. Clara closed the laptop lid. The screen went dark. The betrayal was total. It was absolute. He was already dismantling her life, brick by brick, while she was still living inside of it. She needed help. She could not fight a billionaire alone. She did not know how to trace hidden accounts. She did not know how to file emergency injunctions. But she knew someone who did. Clara picked up her smartphone. She opened her contacts list. She scrolled down to the letter B. Bridget Hayes. Bridget was Clara's oldest friend. They had met in college. While Clara had gone to nursing school, Bridget had gone to law school. Bridget was now one of the most ruthless family law attorneys in the city. She wore sharp suits, drank black coffee, and had a reputation for destroying men who tried to hide assets in divorce proceedings. Bridget had never liked Vance. She had always said his charm felt rehearsed. Clara looked at the time. 2:20 in the morning. She did not care. She pressed the green call button. She lifted the phone to her ear. The line rang. Once, twice, 3 times. This better be an emergency, or someone is getting sued. A groggy, sharp voice answered on the 4th ring. Clara opened her mouth to speak. For a second, a lump formed in her throat. She swallowed it down. Bridget, Clara said. Her voice was completely steady. There was a pause on the other end of the line. The sound of rustling sheets. Clara? Honey, it is 2 in the morning. Is the baby coming? Bridget's voice shifted instantly from annoyed to panicked. No, Clara replied. The baby is fine. Then what is wrong? You sound strange. Clara looked across the dark room. She stared at the closed door of her bedroom. Vance is having an affair with his assistant, Clara said. The words tasted like copper, but she forced them out. He is planning to file for divorce as soon as the Apex merger closes. He just locked me out of our joint banking accounts. And he gave Peyton my grandmother's sapphire ring. Dead silence hung on the phone line for 5 seconds. Clara could hear Bridget breathe, then the sound of a lamp clicking on, the sound of a chair pulling out. I am awake, Bridget said. Her voice was no longer groggy. It was ice cold. It was the voice of a predator entering the hunting ground. Tell me exactly what you have in your possession right now. I have screenshots of text messages, Clara said. I have photo evidence of the ring. I have an audio recording of him admitting he is planning to leave me after the merger. Do you have his laptop? No, just his iPad and my own laptop. Do not touch his laptop, Bridget commanded. Do not confront him. Do not change your behavior. You have to play the perfect pregnant wife tomorrow at that gala. Can you do that? Clara placed her hand on her stomach. The baby shifted, pressing against her ribs. Yes, Clara said. Good, Bridget replied. I am coming to your house at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning after he leaves for the office. We are going to image every hard drive you have access to. We are going to find the money. Okay, Clara whispered. Clara, listen to me. Bridget's voice softened slightly, just for a moment. I am so sorry, but you have to be strong right now. He thinks you are weak. Let him keep thinking that. It is his biggest mistake. I know, Clara said. She ended the call. She set the phone down on the nightstand. The sadness was entirely gone. The memory of the cramped apartment in Seattle faded into dust. The anger was beginning to rise. Clara walked to the window and looked out at the dark street. He thought she was just a boring housewife. He thought she would quietly accept a check and disappear into the suburbs. He had no idea what was coming for him. Clara set the phone down on the nightstand. The digital clock now read 2:30 in the morning. Bridget was coming at 9. But Clara could not wait that long. Dust. The adrenaline was pumping too hard through her veins. It chased away the exhaustion. It chased away the fear. She needed to see the financial damage for herself. She walked quietly out of the master bedroom. The hallway was completely dark. She crept past the closed door of the guest room. She could hear the low, rhythmic sound of Vance snoring inside. He was sleeping soundly. He had zero guilt. He had zero remorse. Clara continued down the sweeping staircase. Her hand gripped the smooth wooden banister. Her bare feet made no sound on the thick carpet. She reached the ground floor and walked toward the back of the house, toward Vance's private home office. She turned the brass handle. It was unlocked. She stepped inside and gently pushed the heavy door shut behind her. It clicked softly. The office smelled like rich mahogany wood, expensive leather, and stale scotch. It was a masculine, intimidating room. It was designed to make visitors feel small. Clara did not turn on the overhead lights, she walked over to the massive executive desk and clicked on a small brass reading lamp. A pool of warm yellow light spilled across the smooth leather desk pad. She looked at the locked bottom drawer on the right side of the desk. Vance always kept it locked. He told her it was for confidential client contracts. Clara knew he was lying. She had known for years. She also knew exactly where he kept the spare key. Because Vance was arrogant, but he was not very original. She reached under the heavy wooden desk. She ran her fingers along the rough, unfinished wood near the back panel. Her finger brushed against a small piece of tape. She peeled the tape away. A tiny silver key dropped into her palm. You are so predictable, Clara whispered to the empty room. She inserted the key into the brass lock on the bottom drawer. She turned it. Click. She pulled the heavy drawer open. It was full of thick manila folders. Clara pulled out the first folder. She set it on the desk under the yellow light. She flipped it open. It was a bank statement. But it did not have the logo of their local bank. It had the logo of an offshore wealth management firm based in the Cayman Islands. Clara scanned the numbers. The account balance was staggering. $12 million. Clara flipped to the next page. A list of recent wire transfers. May 12th, wire transfer, $50,000. Destination, Peyton Croft. Memo, private consulting. June 1st, wire transfer, $100,000. Destination, Peyton Croft. Memo, real estate advance, July 15th, wire transfer, $200,000. Destination, Grand Marquis Hotel Group. Memo, long-term suite lease. The paper trembled in Clara's hands. He was not just buying her dinners. He was funneling the company's capital directly into Peyton's private accounts. He was hiding his liquid assets offshore before he filed the divorce papers. He was making sure that when Clara finally hired a lawyer, the domestic accounts would be completely empty. He was going to leave his pregnant wife and his unborn daughter with nothing. The grief that had been sitting heavy in Clara's chest instantly evaporated. It burned away, leaving absolutely nothing but pure, white-hot rage. The anger was physical. It made her skin prickle. It made her vision sharpen. I will not let him destroy my daughter's future. Clara grabbed her phone from her pocket. She did not care what time it was. She did not care about waking him up. She opened her contacts and clicked on the name Dad. She pressed call. The phone rang twice. Clara? Harrison Winslow's voice came through the speaker. It was thick with sleep, but immediately alert. He never ignored a call from his daughter. Dad, Clara said. Her voice was shaking, but not from sadness. It was shaking with absolute fury. What is wrong, sweetie? Are you in labor? Harrison asked. His deep, gravelly voice was a sharp contrast to Vance's polished tone. Harrison was a man who worked with his hands. He wore faded denim. He drove a rusty Ford truck. He lived in a modest cabin in Montana, at least. That was what Vance thought. That was what everyone thought. No, Dad, the baby is fine, Clara said. She took a deep, shuddering breath. It is Vance. Did he hurt you? The sleepy warmth in Harrison's voice vanished instantly. It was replaced by a cold, terrifying calm. Not physically, Clara said. He is having an affair with his assistant. He has been planning to leave me. He called me repulsive, Dad. He mocked the baby. And I just found his private ledgers. He is hiding $12 million offshore. He is transferring company funds to his mistress. He is going to file for divorce as soon as the Apex merger closes tomorrow. Silence fell over the line. It was a heavy, dangerous silence. Harrison Winslow was a quiet man. He never boasted. He never wore suits. When Vance first met him, Vance had treated Harrison like a simple, uneducated country bumpkin. Vance had even offered to pay for Harrison's dinner, making a loud, obnoxious show of leaving a large tip. Clara had never told Vance the truth. Harrison had asked her not to. He wanted to see who Vance really was, without the influence of money. Just. Harrison Winslow was the founder and majority shareholder of Apex Holdings. He was the ghost investor, the silent billionaire, the man who owned the very firm that Vance was desperately trying to merge with tomorrow night. Vance's entire empire was built on a line of credit from a subsidiary company that Harrison secretly controlled. He called you repulsive, Harrison repeated slowly. Every syllable was laced with venom. Yes, Clara said. He recorded an audio message to her. He said he cannot wait to ship me to the suburbs. More silence. Clara could hear the faint sound of a zipper, the sound of heavy boots hitting a wooden floor. Dad, what should I do? Clara asked. You do exactly what you were going to do, Harrison said smoothly. You wake up tomorrow, you put on a nice dress, you go to that gala, and you smile at the cameras. I cannot look at him, Dad. I want to burn his office to the ground. I know, sweetie. Let the anger keep you focused. But do not show him your hand. You let him think he has won. You let him stand on that stage and act like a king. And then what? Clara asked. And then, Harrison said, the sound of car keys jingling in the background. I am going to walk into that room. I am booking a flight right now. I will be in the city by noon tomorrow. Clara felt a massive wave of relief wash over her. Her father was coming. The cavalry was on the way. He thinks he is untouchable, Dad, Clara whispered. No one is untouchable, Clara, Harrison replied quietly, especially not a man who builds his house on my land. I will see you tomorrow night. Okay, I love you, Dad. I love you too, sweetie. Lock the office. Go back to sleep. The call disconnected. Clara lowered the phone. She looked at the offshore bank statement sitting on the leather desk. She did not cry. She carefully closed the manila folder. She placed it exactly where she found it. She locked the drawer and taped the small silver key back under the desk. Gust. She turned off the brass lamp. The room plunged back into darkness. Clara walked out of the office and quietly closed the door. She walked back up the stairs, feeling completely different than she had an hour ago. The victim was gone. The weeping, confused wife was dead. She walked past Vance's door. She did not feel sick. She felt ready. Let the gala begin. The sharp, metallic beep of the digital cough maker pierced the quiet morning kitchen. Dead. It was exactly 9 o'clock. Vance had left for the corporate office 20 minutes ago. He was rushing, shouting into his phone about table arrangements and press releases. He did not even look at Clara before he walked out the door. 2 minutes later, a sleek black sedan pulled into the driveway. Bridget Hayes marched through the front door. She was wearing a sharp, charcoal gray suit. She carried a heavy leather briefcase. She did not offer a hug, she did not offer sympathy. She offered a battle plan. "Show me the office," Bridget said. For the next 2 hours, the house was entirely silent except for the clicking of Bridget's keyboard. She plugged a small, black external drive into Vance's desktop computer. She extracted the ledgers. She copied the emails. She documented the wire transfers to the Cayman Islands. When it was over, Bridget snapped her briefcase shut. "He is incredibly arrogant," Bridget said, taking a sip of black coffee. "He left a digital trail a mile wide. The offshore accounts are fully documented. The transfers to Peyton Croft are logged. I have enough evidence here to freeze every single liquid asset he has by Monday morning." Clara stood by the window. She crossed her arms over her chest. "What about tonight?" Clara asked. "Tonight you play the part," Bridget instructed. "You wear the dress. You smile for the cameras. You give him the rope he needs to hang himself in front of the apex board. I will have the emergency injunctions ready to file at dawn." Bridget left at noon. The afternoon crawled by in agonizing slow motion. At 5 o'clock, Clara began to get ready. She stood in the massive walk-in closet. The heavy, dark blue silk dress hung from a padded hanger. Vance had ordered it specifically for this night. Clara pulled the cold silk over her head. She reached behind her back, struggling to pull the zipper up. The fabric pulled tight across her ribs. It compressed her swollen belly. It was restrictive. It was suffocating. She walked into the bathroom and stared at the mirror. Her hands began to shake. She reached for a tube of red lipstick. She gripped the plastic tube tightly. She watched her own reflection. Her fingers trembled so violently she could barely remove the cap. She paused. She took a deep, shuddering breath in, out. She planted her elbows firmly on the marble vanity to steady her hands. She applied the red lipstick perfectly, not a single smudge. She looked at her own eyes in the glass. "My silence is not weakness. It is strategy." She repeated the statement in her mind. It anchored her. At exactly 6:30, a black town car arrived to take her to the Grand Marquis Hotel. The downtown ballroom was a sensory overload. Clara stepped out of the elevator. The air was thick with the smell of roasted meats, sharp champagne, and heavy floral perfumes. A massive wall of white orchids served as a backdrop for the press photographers. The room was buzzing with the low, loud hum of 500 people talking at once. The clinking of crystal glasses rang out like tiny bells. Vance was standing near the entrance. He looked immaculate in a custom black tuxedo. He was laughing loudly with a group of older men in expensive gray suits, the board members from Apex Holdings. Vance spotted Clara. His fake smile widened perfectly. He walked over and wrapped his arm tightly around her waist. His fingers dug sharply into her ribs, a silent warning to perform well. "Gentlemen," Vance announced smoothly, "allow me to introduce my beautiful wife, Clara, and our soon-to-be daughter." Camera shutters clicked aggressively. Flash bulbs blinded her. "She is glowing, Vance," one of the older executives said, raising his champagne glass. "You are a lucky man. A stable family is the foundation of a strong business. That is what we believe at Apex." "I could not agree more," Vance replied. He kissed Clara's cheek. His lips felt like ice. Clara forced herself to smile. She nodded politely. She let him guide her through the crowded room like a prized, expensive show pony. Then, the crowd parted slightly. Peyton Croft stepped forward. She was holding a silver clipboard. She was wearing a sleek, form-fitting black dress. Her blonde hair was pulled back into a severe, elegant twist. "Mr. Sterling," Tust, Peyton said. Her voice was strictly professional, but her eyes were dancing with cruel amusement. "The seating arrangements for the VIP lounge have been finalized. The catering staff is ready for the toast." "Excellent work, Peyton," Vance said. He did not look at her too long. He played the professional boss perfectly. But Clara saw it. As Peyton reached up to tuck a stray piece of blonde hair behind her ear, her left hand caught the light of the crystal chandeliers. She was wearing the ring. The heavy, vintage sapphire was turned inward toward her palm, hidden from casual observers. But the worn gold band was clearly visible. Peyton locked eyes with Clara. The young assistant offered a small, knowing smirk, a secret smile that screamed victory. Clara felt the baby kick violently against her ribs. The blue silk dress suddenly felt like a straitjacket. She was standing in a room of 500 people, governors, senators, and billionaires. but she had never felt so entirely, completely alone. Everyone in the room was looking at her, but no one actually saw her. They only saw the pregnant prop standing next to the successful genius. Vance dropped his hand from Clara's waist. "I need to go speak with the lead investors in the private lounge," Vance whispered in Clara's ear. His voice was cold and detached. "Stay out here, mingle with the wives, do not drink anything strange, and for God's sake, fix your posture. You are slouching." He turned and walked away. Peyton followed, 3 steps behind him, her silver clipboard pressed against her chest. Clara stood frozen near a massive ice sculpture. Teaked. The freezing air radiating from the melting ice chilled her bare arms. She watched her husband and his mistress disappear behind the heavy oak doors of the VIP lounge. The noise of the ballroom swirled around her. The laughter. The clinking glasses. The string quartet playing softly in the corner. Her chest grew incredibly tight. The walls of the grand ballroom seemed to shrink. The smell of the white orchids suddenly made her deeply nauseous. She needed to sit down. She needed to breathe. Clara set her sparkling water on a passing waiter's tray. She turned away from the crowded dance floor. She began to walk slowly toward the back of the venue, toward the quiet, carpeted hallway that led to the VIP lounge. She just wanted to find a quiet chair. She had no idea what was waiting for her behind those heavy oak doors. The thick, patterned carpet in the long hallway muffled the sound of Clara's footsteps. The loud, chaotic noise of the grand ballroom slowly faded behind her. The heavy bass of the string quartet became a dull, distant thud. The hallway was lined with antique oil paintings and dimly lit wall sconces. It felt like a tunnel, just. Clara pressed her hand against her stomach. The baby was rolling. It was an uncomfortable, heavy pressure against her lungs. The restrictive blue silk dress pinched her skin with every step. She just needed 5 minutes. She needed to sit in a quiet chair and drink her sparkling water. At the end of the long corridor were the heavy oak doors of the private VIP lounge. Clara walked slower. Her swollen feet throbbed inside her silver heels. As she got closer, she noticed that the right door was not completely shut. It was cracked open just a few inches. A thick slice of warm, amber light spilled out onto the dark carpet. She could smell it before she heard it. The sharp, peaty scent of expensive scotch and the heavy, illegal aroma of a lit cigar. Then she heard the laughter. It was loud, it was arrogant. It was the sound of men who felt they owned the world. Clara stopped walking. She stood completely still in the shadows of the hallway. "I am telling you, Richard." Vance's voice cut through the laughter. It was crystal clear. It echoed slightly in the large, private room. "The public relations strategy is flawless. The press eats up the devoted family man narrative." Clara felt a cold spike of dread pierce her chest. She stepped slightly to the side, pressing her shoulder against the cool wallpaper. She peered through the narrow crack in the heavy oak doors. Vance was standing by a grand, unlit fireplace. He held a crystal glass of amber liquid. 2 older board members from Apex Holdings were sitting in leather armchairs, puffing on thick cigars. And Peyton was standing right next to Vance. She was close. Too close for a professional setting. Her left hand was resting casually on the back of Vance's leather chair. The sapphire ring caught the firelight. "But what about after the merger? Vance?" one of the executives asked. He took a long drag from his cigar. "A divorce immediately following a major acquisition can make the market nervous. The optics can get messy." Vance took a sip of his scotch. He smiled lazily. "It will not be messy," Vance said smoothly. "I have entirely isolated her finances. She has absolutely nothing. She will sign whatever document I put in front of her." Peyton let out a soft, cruel laugh. "She still thinks she is part of the team. It is almost sad to watch." Vance shook his head. He looked down into his glass. "She is exhausting," Vance said. His voice hardened. "The fake charm completely evaporated. Walking into that house every night is suffocating. She is enormous. She just waddles around these massive sweatpants complaining about her back. It is completely repulsive." The 2 older men chuckled darkly. They clinked their glasses. Clara stopped breathing. Her hands flew up to cover her mouth. Tussed. The blue silk tightened around her ribs like an iron band. "Once the kid pops out," Vance continued, his voice projecting clearly through the crack in the door, "I am cutting her a check, and shipping her to a house in the suburbs. Out of sight, out of mind. Peyton is the future of this brand. Peyton understands the corporate vision. Vance reached out. He placed his hand firmly on Peyton's lower back, right in front of the board members. It was a clear, undeniable declaration. The men raised their glasses again in a silent toast. Clara stumbled backward. Her silver heel caught the edge of the thick hallway carpet. She almost fell. She caught herself heavily against the wall. The rough, textured wallpaper scraped the bare skin of her shoulder. She did not gasp. She did not cry out. The pain was far too deep for sound. It bypassed her heart and went straight into her bones. He was not just leaving her. He was actively humiliating her. Turned. He was parading his mistress in front of the very men who controlled his future. He was using Clara's pregnant body as a punchline for his corporate jokes. Clara turned away from the door. She needed to hide. She moved blindly down the corridor. Her vision blurred with thick, hot tears. She pushed open the heavy wooden door to the women's restroom. The bathroom was massive. It was covered in stark white marble and bright fluorescent lights. It was entirely empty. Clara rushed into the farthest stall. She slammed the heavy door shut. She slid the metal lock into place with a sharp clack. She sank down. She collapsed onto the cold tile floor, uncaring about the expensive blue silk dress getting dirty. Total darkness fell over her mind. This was the absolute bottom. This was the darkest place. She pulled her knees up to her chest as far as her pregnant belly would allow. She wrapped her arms tightly around her head. She pressed her face into her knees. She sobbed. It was a violent, silent shaking. Her shoulders heaved. Her chest cracked wide open. The betrayal ripped through every single cell in her body. She cried for the young girl in the Seattle apartment. She cried for the grandmother whose ring was stolen. She cried for the unborn daughter who would never know a whole, unbroken family. She stayed on the floor for a long time. The tile was freezing against her legs. Slowly, the violent shaking began to subside. The tears stopped falling. Her lungs burned. Clara reached out and grabbed the metal assist bar on the wall. She pulled herself up. Her joints ached terribly. Her legs felt like they were made of solid lead. She unlocked the stall door. She stepped out into the bright, blinding light of the main bathroom. She walked over to the row of pristine white sinks. She leaned heavily over the cold marble counter. She reached out and turned the brass handle. The water rushed out. It was a steady, heavy stream. Clara stood there. She did not look in the mirror. She just listened to the sound. The water hit the porcelain basin. It swirled down the silver drain, a constant, rushing noise. For 3 full minutes, that was the only sound in the room, the rush of the water, the slow, steady rhythm of her own breathing. In, out, in, out. The chaotic noise of the world washed down the drain. The panic washed away with it. She cupped her hands. She caught the freezing cold water. She splashed it onto her face. It shocked her skin. It washed away the tears. It washed away the carefully applied foundation. She splashed her face again and again. The cold water clarified her mind. The deep vulnerability began to harden into something else. Something heavy. Something absolutely unbreakable. She reached for a thick paper towel. She dried her face gently. She finally looked up. She met her own eyes in the massive, brightly lit mirror. Her face was pale. Her makeup was slightly smeared. But her eyes were entirely different. They were no longer the eyes of a terrified, confused victim. They were the eyes of a survivor. The compliant, terrified wife Vance Sterling knew died in that bathroom stall. The woman staring back in the mirror was someone else entirely. Clara dropped the damp paper towel into the brass trash can. She smoothed the wrinkles out of the blue silk dress. It was time to go back to the VIP room. The brass handle of the bathroom door was freezing against her palm. Clara pushed it open. She stepped back out into the dimly lit hallway. The string quartet in the main ballroom was playing a faster tempo now. The music bounced off the high ceilings. But Clara did not hear the melody. She only heard the steady, rhythmic beating of her own heart. She was done hiding. She was done crying in dark closets and empty bathrooms. She walked back down the long, carpeted corridor. Her silver heels clicked sharply against the floorboards underneath the fabric. Click, 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 a steady march. She reached the heavy oak doors of the VIP lounge. The crack of amber light was still there. The laughter had died down, replaced by the low murmur of business negotiations. Clara did not hesitate. She did not knock. She placed both hands flat against the heavy wood. She pushed hard. The doors swung open wide. They hit the doorstops with a loud wooden thud. The room went instantly dead silent. Clara stepped inside. The air was thick and suffocating. It smelled of burning tobacco and expensive leather. 4 pairs of eyes snapped toward her. The 2 older board members lowered their cigars. Peyton froze, quickly dropping her hand from the back of Vance's chair. Vance turned around. His perfectly practiced smile vanished instantly. His jaw tightened. A flash of pure, unadulterated fury crossed his dark eyes. He hated being interrupted. He hated losing control of his narrative. "Clara," Vance said. His voice was dangerously low. It was the tone he used when he was about to punish an employee. "What are you doing in here? This is a private meeting." Clara stood tall. The blue silk dress hung perfectly on her frame. She did not cross her arms. She did not look at the floor. She looked directly into her husband's eyes. "I needed some quiet," Clara said. Her voice was completely steady. It did not shake. Vance let out a sharp, condescending sigh. He looked at the 2 Apex executives and offered a tight, apologetic smile. "Gentlemen, I apologize," Vance said, shaking his head slightly. "Pregnancy hormones. The noise out there is a bit much for her. Let me just handle this." He set his crystal glass of scotch down on a small side table. He walked briskly toward Clara. As he approached, he reached out to grab her upper arm. His grip was entirely too tight. It was meant to hurt. It was meant to steer her quickly out the door. "You are embarrassing me," Vance hissed under his breath, leaning in close so the board members could not hear. "You look unhinged. Get out of here right now and call the driver to take you home." Clara looked down at his hand, gripping her arm. She did not whisper. She did not shrink. "Let go of me," Clara said loudly. Her voice carried across the quiet room. Vance's eyes widened slightly in shock. She had never spoken to him like that, not in 7 years. He quickly dropped his hand. He took a half step backward, trying to maintain his composed facade for the investors watching them. "Clara, please," Vance said, his voice dripping with fake concern. "You are clearly not feeling well. You are being completely irrational. Let Peyton escort you to the car." Peyton stepped forward. Her black heels clicked on the hardwood floor. She gave Clara a sickeningly sweet smile. "Come on, Mrs. Sterling," Peyton said, reaching a hand out. The vintage sapphire ring gleamed under the warm ceiling lights. "Let us get you home. You need to rest that back of yours." Clara shifted her gaze from Vance to Peyton. Dust. She looked at the ring. Then she looked at Peyton's eyes. "If you touch me," Clara said evenly, "I will break your fingers." Peyton stopped dead in her tracks. The fake smile dropped from her face completely. She looked at Vance, unsure of what to do. The obedient, boring housewife was suddenly entirely off script. One of the older board members cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Vance, perhaps we should reschedule." "No, Richard. It is fine," Vance snapped, losing his temper. He turned his glare back to Clara. The mask was completely off. "You are ruining the most important night of my life, Clara. You are acting crazy. Leave now." Clara took a deep breath, tossed. She opened her mouth to tell the executives exactly where Vance had hidden his money. She was ready to burn his empire to the ground, right then and there. But she never got the chance. A sudden loud noise interrupted her. The heavy oak doors behind Clara swung open again. This time they hit the walls with tremendous force. The heavy brass handles clattered against the wood paneling. Everyone in the room jumped. Clara turned around. Standing in the doorway was Harrison Winslow. He was not wearing a tuxedo. He was not wearing a silk tie. He wore a simple, tailored charcoal gray suit. No tie. The top button of his crisp white shirt was undone. His thick silver hair was brushed neatly back. He looked completely out of place in a room full of flashy billionaires, and yet he commanded the space entirely. He stood perfectly still, his broad shoulders filling the doorframe. He looked like an old, immovable mountain. Clara felt the tension instantly drain from her shoulders. She stood up a little straighter. Harrison stepped into the room. His heavy leather boots made a solid, grounding thud on the floorboards. Vance let out a loud, exasperated groan. He threw his hands up in the air. "Are you kidding me?" Vance shouted. He looked at the security guard who had nervously followed Harrison down the hall. Who let the old man in? This is a highly secure, private event. Get him out of here. Harrison did not look at Vance. He did not look at Peyton. He walked directly over to Clara. He reached out and gently placed his large, warm hand on her shoulder. It was the exact opposite of Vance's cruel grip. It was pure protection. Are you okay, sweetie? Harrison asked. His deep voice rumbled in the quiet room. I am now, Dad, Clara said. Vance scoffed loudly. He picked up his scotch glass again, shaking his head in disbelief. Harrison, this is not a country fair, just. Vance mocked, gesturing around the luxurious room. This is a billion-dollar merger negotiation. You have absolutely no business being here. Take your daughter and go back to your truck. Harrison finally turned his head. He looked at Vance. His eyes were cold, dark, and utterly merciless. I have every business being here, Vance, Harrison said slowly. Because you are standing in my building. The room fell into an absolute suffocating silence. The room fell into an absolute suffocating silence. The string quartet playing out in the main ballroom suddenly sounded a million miles away. The air in the VIP lounge grew incredibly heavy. The two older board members from Apex Holdings stopped breathing. The smoke from their thick cigars curled slowly toward the high, painted ceiling. Vance stared at Harrison. For 3 long seconds, Vance's brain completely short-circuited. He could not process the words. Then Vance let out a loud, obnoxious laugh. It was a harsh barking sound. My building? Vance mocked. Just. He shook his head and looked at the board members as if sharing a joke. Did you forget to take your medication, Harrison? You are a retired mechanic who lives in a cabin. You do not own anything but a rusted Ford truck. Now, turn around and walk out before I have security drag you out. Harrison did not move. He did not blink. He kept his large, calloused hand resting gently on Clara's shoulder. Just. I drove the rusted truck tonight, Harrison said, his voice a low, terrifying rumble. I parked it right next to your leased sports car. Suddenly, the older board member named Richard stood up from his leather armchair. His face was entirely pale. His hands were shaking violently. He dropped his expensive cigar into the crystal ashtray. Richard ignored Vance completely. He took 2 steps forward and quickly buttoned his suit jacket. He bowed his head slightly. Mr. Winslow, Richard said, his voice trembling with deep respect. We did not expect you tonight. The executive team was told you were remaining at the Montana property for the quarter. Vance stopped laughing. The smug, arrogant smirk froze on his face. He looked at Richard. Then he looked at Harrison. Then back to Richard. Richard, what are you doing? Vance asked. His voice was suddenly an octave higher. What are you talking about? His name is Harrison. He is Clara's father. His name is Harrison Winslow, Richard said, refusing to look at Vance. He kept his eyes respectfully fixed on the older man. He is the founder and sole chairman of Apex Holdings. He is the majority shareholder of the very fund we represent. Vance's mouth fell open. The crystal glass of scotch in his hand tilted. A few drops of amber liquid spilled over the rim and splashed onto his expensive black leather shoes. He looked like a man who had just been told the earth was flat. The blood drained completely from his face, leaving his skin the color of dirty snow. Harrison slowly took his hand off Clara's shoulder. He walked slowly across the room. His heavy boots thumped against the hardwood floor. He stopped in front of the massive glass coffee table in the center of the lounge. Her father did not raise a weapon. He just dropped a single folder, smack. The thick manila folder hit the heavy glass table. The sharp sound echoed off the wood-paneled walls like a gunshot. Harrison reached down and unwound the red string, holding the folder closed. He flipped the cover open. 7 years ago, Harrison began, looking directly at Vance. His voice was cold, precise, and absolutely lethal. A young, frantic kid came to a small venture capital firm in Seattle. He had a decent algorithm for real estate mapping, but he had absolutely zero capital. He was drowning in $90,000 of credit card debt. He was 3 days away from being evicted from his apartment. Vance swallowed hard. His Adam's apple bobbed up and down. He took a tiny step backward. Clara stood tall by the door. Her spine was steel. The blue silk dress no longer felt restrictive. It felt like impenetrable armor. She watched the man who had terrorized her shrink into nothingness. Harrison continued. That Seattle firm approved a massive, unsecured loan. They bought the debt. They funded the servers. They built the absolute foundation for sterling real estate tech. And they put the entire investment under a blind, anonymous holding company. Harrison tapped a thick stack of legal papers inside the folder. I am that holding company, Vance, Harrison said. I own the debt. I own the servers. I own the patents to your algorithm. I own 90% of your equity. I own the chair you are sitting in, and I own the walls around you. No, just, Vance whispered. His voice was breathless, frantic. No, that is impossible. You let me pay for your dinners. You let me buy you drinks. I let you show me exactly who you are, Harrison corrected him. I wanted to see how you treat people when you think they have nothing to offer you. It turns out you treat them like garbage. You treat my daughter like garbage. Vance looked around the room wildly. He was looking for an exit. He was looking for a way to spin the narrative. He reverted instantly to his favorite tactic: deflect and attack. Clara is lying to you. Harrison, Vance practically shouted, pointing a shaking finger at his wife. She is hormonal. She is crazy. We are just going through a rough patch. This is a private marital issue. Harrison did not yell. He just flipped to the next page in the folder. This morning, Harrison said smoothly, my daughter S. attorney sent me a very interesting file. It seems you have been incredibly busy, Vance. $12 million transferred to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands over the last 6 months. The two board members gasped loudly. Embezzlement right before a corporate merger was not just bad business, it was federal fraud. $300,000, Harrison continued, reading from the ledger, embezzled directly from company operating funds, used to pay for luxury hotel suites, designer jewelry, and direct wire transfers to an employee named Peyton Croft. Peyton gasped. She stepped backwards so fast her heels stumbled on the carpet. She hit the wood-paneled wall and froze like a cornered animal. That is a lie, Vance screamed. His polished demeanor was entirely gone. His hair was slightly disheveled. He was sweating profusely. Those documents are forged. Clara hacked my computer. She is trying to ruin the merger because she is jealous. Harrison slowly closed the folder. He looked at Richard. Richard, Harrison said quietly, call the forensic accounting team. Trigger the morality clause in the subsidiary contracts. Freeze all of Sterling's corporate accounts. Immediately, shut off his access cards to the building. Yes, Mr. Winslow, right away, Richard said. He pulled his cell phone from his pocket and practically ran out of the room, desperate to distance himself from Vance. Vance dropped his crystal glass. It hit the floor and bounced on the thick carpet, spilling the rest of the scotch everywhere. The room suddenly smelled heavily of alcohol and nervous sweat. Vance finally understood. He never built the empire. He was just renting it. He was not a genius. He was a tenant, and his landlord had just evicted him. Clara watched the complete and total dismantling of her husband's ego. It was beautiful. It was surgical. There was no screaming match. There was no thrown furniture. There was just the cold, hard, undeniable truth. She turned her head and looked at Peyton. Peyton was staring at Vance with pure, unadulterated horror. The charm of the young billionaire had vanished into thin air. He was no longer a golden ticket to high society. He was a broke, desperate man facing a massive federal investigation. Clara witnessed the universal truth of fair-weather loyalty. It is just like the friend who says, I never liked him anyway. I just smiled at the wedding. When the money stops, the devotion evaporates instantly. Peyton did not run to Vance's side to comfort him. She did not hold his hand. Instead, Peyton looked down at her own left hand. She stared at the vintage sapphire ring. Her hands were shaking. She reached over and grabbed the massive blue stone. She pulled the ring off her finger. She took 2 steps toward the small side table. She dropped the ring onto the polished wood. It made a sharp, definitive clink, just. Peyton did not look at Vance. She did not look at Clara. She turned on her black stiletto heels and walked quickly out of the heavy oak doors, disappearing into the crowded hallway. She abandoned him the exact second he became useless to her. Vance stood alone in the center of the room. He looked at the empty doorway where his mistress had just fled. Then he looked at the man who had just destroyed his life. Finally, Vance looked at Clara. He fell to his knees, literally. His expensive black trousers hit the wet scotch-soaked carpet. He dropped his head into his hands. "Clara, please," Vance begged. His voice was a pathetic, broken whine. It was the voice of a coward. "Tell him to stop. Tell him we can fix this. I love you, Clara. Baby, think about the baby. Peyton meant absolutely nothing to me. I was just stressed. Please, you have to save me." Clara stood by the doorway. Tut. She looked down at the man begging on the floor. She searched her heart. She waited for the pity to arrive. She waited for the old habit of nurturing him to kick in. But there was nothing. The well was completely dry. She felt absolutely no anger. She felt no sadness. She felt a profound, overwhelming peace wash over her entire body. The heavy weight that had been crushing her chest for the last 24 hours was entirely gone. "You called me repulsive, Vance," Clara said quietly. Her voice was calm. It was the voice of a stranger. "You said you could not wait to ship me away. You got your wish. I am leaving." Vance sobbed loudly into his hands. It was an ugly, desperate sound. Clara turned away from him. She did not want to look at him anymore. She walked over to the small side table. She picked up her grandmother's sapphire ring. She slipped it into the pocket of her blue silk dress. It felt heavy. It felt like home. She walked back to her father. Harrison offered her his arm. Clara looped her hand through it. They walked out of the VIP lounge together, leaving the heavy oak doors wide open behind them. They left Vance Sterling on his knees in the dark, crying over an empire that never really belonged to him. The morning light poured through the large, arched windows of the nursery. It was a soft, pale yellow light. It warmed the cold hardwood floors. Clara stood in front of the white wooden dresser. She held a tiny, white cotton onesie in her hands. The fabric was incredibly soft against her skin. It smelled heavily of lavender baby detergent. She folded the left sleeve inward. Then the right, she smoothed the wrinkles with the palm of her hand. She placed it perfectly on top of a small, neat stack inside the top drawer. She reached back into the woven laundry basket. She pulled out a pale green blanket. She folded it. She smoothed the edges. She placed it next to the white clothes, organizing the nursery clothes by color, seeking control in a world spinning out of orbit. It was a quiet, repetitive task, but it felt incredibly healing. The frantic, terrified energy that had consumed her for the last 24 hours was completely gone. In its place was a solid, quiet strength. The house was completely silent. Vance had not come home last night. After Harrison had exposed him at the gala, Vance had fled the hotel. Clara did not know where he went. She did not care. She closed the nursery drawer with a soft click. Downstairs, the heavy brass knocker on the front door echoed through the large house. Clara walked slowly out of the nursery. She moved down the sweeping staircase. She was wearing comfortable, loose gray sweatpants and an oversized cashmere sweater. The restrictive blue silk dress from the night before was currently sitting at the bottom of a garbage bag in the garage. She unlocked the heavy wooden front door and pulled it open. Bridget stood on the porch. She was wearing a sharp navy blue suit. She held a cardboard tray with 2 large cups of coffee in one hand. In her other hand, she gripped her massive leather briefcase. She looked incredibly well-rested. She looked like a predator that had just finished a highly satisfying meal. "Good morning," Bridget said, stepping inside. She handed Clara a cup of coffee. "Decaf for you, with the sweet cream you like." "Thank you," Clara said. The warm cup felt good against her palms. "Did you sleep at all?" "Sleep is for people who are not currently destroying billionaires," Bridget replied with a sharp, brilliant smile. She walked straight into the formal dining room and dropped her heavy briefcase onto the mahogany table. Clara followed her. She pulled out a chair and sat down slowly. Her back was aching, but it was a normal, physical ache, not the crushing weight of betrayal. Bridget popped the brass latches on her briefcase. She pulled out a thick stack of documents printed on heavy legal paper. "It is done, Clara," Bridget said. Just. Her voice was strictly professional now. At 6 o'clock this morning, a federal judge signed the emergency injunctions. Apex Holdings officially filed charges for corporate embezzlement. Just. The authorities froze the Cayman Island accounts before Vance even realized what was happening. Clara took a sip of her coffee. The sweet cream coated her tongue. "What about the domestic accounts?" Clara asked. "Frozen," Bridget stated simply. Apex Holdings triggered the morality clause in the subsidiary contracts. Vance's entire company is being placed into a corporate receivership. Your father was incredibly thorough. Vance does not just lose his job. He loses his equity. He loses his stock options. He loses his corporate credit cards. And the house? The house is owned by a trust, Bridget explained, tapping a piece of paper. A trust controlled by Apex. You are allowed to stay here as long as you want. Vance is legally barred from the premises, pending the fraud investigation. As if on cue, the sound of a loud, frantic banging echoed from the front of the house. Clara froze. The coffee cup stopped halfway to her mouth. Someone was yanking violently on the front door handle. The lock rattled loudly against the heavy wood frame. "Clara!" Vance's muffled voice shouted from outside. "Clara, open the door! My key card is not working! Open the damn door!" Bridget did not flinch. She just took a calm sip of her black coffee. "I had the estate manager disable his access codes at midnight," Bridget said quietly. "Do you want me to call the police?" Clara looked toward the foyer. She thought about the terrified woman she had been just yesterday. The woman who had scrubbed the kitchen floor until her knuckles bled. The woman who had hidden in a bathroom stall. That woman was gone. "No," Clara said softly. She set her coffee cup down on the table. "I will handle him." Clara stood up. She walked out of the dining room and crossed the large foyer. She reached out and turned the deadbolt. She pulled the heavy wooden door open. Vance stumbled forward, almost falling into the house. He looked absolutely horrific. He was still wearing the custom black tuxedo from the gala, but it was completely ruined. The jacket was violently wrinkled. The silk bow tie hung loosely around his neck. His white dress shirt was stained with spilled scotch and sweat. His dark hair, usually slicked back perfectly, was a chaotic mess. He smelled terrible, a pungent mixture of stale alcohol, fear, and cheap hotel soap. He looked up at Clara. His eyes were bloodshot and wild. "Why is my code not working?" Vance demanded, his voice cracking. He tried to push past her into the house. Clara did not move. She planted her feet firmly in the doorway. She crossed her arms over her pregnant belly. "You do not live here anymore, Vance," Clara said evenly. Vance stared at her. He blinked hard, trying to focus his bloodshot eyes. He noticed Bridget standing in the background, leaning casually against the archway of the dining room. The sight of the divorce attorney seemed to snap him back to reality. The aggressive anger instantly morphed into desperate panic. He utilized his favorite tactic: deny, attack, reverse victim. "Clara, you have to stop this," Vance pleaded. His hand shook as he reached out toward her. "Your father is out of control. He froze my accounts. My cards declined at the hotel this morning. I had to walk 3 miles to get here. You are ruining our family over a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding?" Clara asked. Her voice was dangerously quiet. "Yes," Vance shouted, tears springing to his eyes. "Peyton meant nothing. It was just stress. You know how much pressure I am under with this merger." "You are doing this to our child, Clara. You are leaving our baby without a father." Clara stared at the pathetic man standing on her porch. "You left this family a long time ago, Vance," Clara stated plainly. "You left it when you started funneling money to the Cayman Islands. You left it when you stole my grandmother's ring. And you destroyed it completely when you called me repulsive to your board members." Vance gasped slightly. He had forgotten she heard that part. The reality of his own cruelty hung heavily in the morning air. "I was drunk," Vance whispered. "It was a weak, pathetic excuse. I did not mean it." "It does not matter if you meant it," Clara said. "It only matters that I heard it." Clara stepped back. She gestured toward the formal dining room. "Come inside, Vance," Clara commanded. "We are going to finish this." Vance walked slowly into the house. He looked around the grand foyer, like he was seeing it for the first time. The expensive artwork, the crystal chandelier. He was suddenly realizing that none of it had ever really belonged to him. He walked into the dining room. He stood at the opposite end of the long mahogany table, the same spot where he had sat last night, ignoring her while he texted his mistress. Bridget picked up a thick manila envelope from the table. She slid it smoothly across the polished wood. The heavy envelope stopped right at the edge of the table, directly in front of Vance. "What is this?" Vance asked. His voice was trembling. Those are the divorce papers, Clara said. She remained standing near the archway. Bridget drafted them this morning. I have already signed them. Vance looked at the envelope like it was a live explosive. I am not signing anything without my lawyers, Vance snapped, trying to summon a final shred of authority. You cannot just take half of everything I built. We have a prenuptial agreement. Bridget let out a short, sharp laugh. It was a cruel sound. You should really read the documents, Vance, Bridget said smoothly. Because your lawyers all quit this morning when the embezzlement charges dropped. They do not work for free. And as for the prenuptial agreement, it dictates a 50-50 split of all marital assets. Exactly, Vance said, a glimmer of desperate hope returning to his eyes. Half, you get half. Vance, Clara said softly. The absolute pity in her voice made him freeze. Bridget leaned forward, placing both hands flat on the table. You do not own any assets, Vance, Bridget explained slowly, as if she were speaking to a small, slow child. The company equity belongs to Apex Holdings. The cash in the offshore accounts is seized by federal authorities. The cars are corporate leases. This house is owned by a private trust. Your net worth, as of 6 o'clock this morning, is exactly $0. The color drained from Vance's face once again. He gripped the edge of the mahogany table to stop himself from collapsing. Half of zero is zero, Vance, Bridget stated flatly. The court cannot divide nothing. You are signing away your marital rights to Clara. In exchange, she is agreeing not to file a civil suit against you for the emotional and financial distress you caused. It is the best deal you will ever get in your entire life. Sign the papers. Vance looked down at the manila envelope. He had spent 7 years lying, cheating, and stealing. He had sacrificed his marriage, his morals, and his unborn child on the altar of his own massive ego. He had believed he was an untouchable king. And now he was standing in a wrinkled tuxedo, smelling of cheap soap with absolutely nothing to his name. He reached a shaking hand into his jacket pocket. He pulled out an expensive gold pen. His hand trembled violently as he opened the envelope. He pulled out the thick stack of papers. He flipped to the last page. He did not read the terms. He did not argue. The fight was completely beaten out of him. He pressed the gold pen to the paper. He signed his name. The ink scratched loudly against the silence of the room. He threw the pen onto the table. It rolled off the edge and hit the floor with a dull clatter. Vance looked up at Clara. His eyes were empty. There was no anger left. Only the hollow, terrifying void of a man who had entirely destroyed himself. Where am I supposed to go? Vance asked. It was a genuine question. A pathetic plea for help from the woman he used to command. Clara looked at him. She felt the baby flutter gently against her ribs. She remembered the audio recording. She remembered his cruel, laughing voice. I am cutting her a check and shipping her to a house in the suburbs. I do not know, Vance, Clara said. Her voice was completely devoid of emotion. But you cannot stay here. Walk out the front door and do not ever come back. Vance stared at her for a long moment. He was waiting for her to break. He was waiting for her to offer him a lifeline. She just stared back, unblinking. Slowly, Vance turned around. He walked out of the dining room. He walked across the grand foyer. He opened the heavy wooden front door. He stepped out onto the porch. Clara walked forward. She reached out and grabbed the brass handle. She did not slam the door. She just closed it firmly. The heavy metal lock clicked into place. The sound echoed through the quiet house. A permanent, undeniable finality. Clara took a deep breath. The air in the foyer smelled clean. It smelled like lavender and old wood. She placed both hands on her stomach. She smiled. She was completely free. 3 weeks later, the pain in Clara's lower back was no longer a dull, heavy ache. It was a sharp, all-consuming fire. But this pain was entirely different from the agonizing stress of the past month. This pain had a purpose. It was not breaking her down. It was breaking her open to bring something new into the world. The private hospital room was bathed in warm, golden afternoon sunlight. The light angled through the large window, casting long, peaceful shadows across the sterile white tile floor. The air smelled of sharp antiseptic alcohol wipes and fresh, clean cotton linens. The fetal heart monitor next to the bed chirped with a steady, rapid rhythm. One more big push, Clara, the attending doctor said gently. You are almost there. You are doing perfectly. Clara squeezed her eyes shut, sweat beaded on her forehead. She gripped the cold metal side rails of the hospital bed. Her knuckles turned stark white. Standing right beside her, holding her left shoulder, was Harrison. He was wearing a faded denim shirt. He looked like a normal, anxious grandfather, not a ruthless corporate billionaire. His large, calloused hand provided a heavy, grounding anchor for Clara in the turbulent waves of labor. Clara took a massive, shuddering breath. She pushed with absolutely every ounce of strength left in her exhausted body. Suddenly, the pressure vanished. The room fell quiet for one terrifying, suspended second. Then the silence broke. A sharp, loud, beautiful wail filled the room. The first cry of her daughter washed away the last trace of him. Clara fell back against the pillows. She was gasping for air. Her chest heaved. Tears streamed down her cheeks. But they were not tears of grief. They were tears of pure, unadulterated triumph. She is perfect, Clara, the doctor announced with a warm smile. A beautiful, healthy baby girl. The nurses quickly cleaned the crying infant. They wrapped her tightly in a soft, white hospital blanket with thin blue and pink stripes. Taunt. The nurse walked over and gently laid the baby onto Clara's chest. The heavy, warm weight of her daughter settled directly over Clara's heart. The baby stopped crying immediately. She opened her dark blue eyes, blinking against the bright sunlight. She let out a tiny soft sigh and snuggled her face into Clara's neck. She smelled like pure new life. Clara wrapped her arms around the small bundle. She pressed her lips to the top of the baby's head. Harrison leaned over. He gently stroked his granddaughter's cheek with his massive index finger. A single tear escaped his eye and rolled down his weathered face. "Hello, little one," Harrison whispered, his deep voice thick with emotion. "Welcome to the world." The door to the hospital room clicked open. Bridget stepped quietly inside. The fierce, terrifying lawyer had completely vanished. She was carrying a massive bouquet of pink peonies. Her eyes were red. She had been crying in the waiting room for 2 hours. Bridget walked over to the bed. She looked down at the baby. "Well," Bridget whispered, wiping her eyes. "She certainly did not get his nose. Thank God for that." Clara laughed. It was a bright, genuine sound. It felt completely foreign in her throat, but it belonged there. Dust. "Her name is Eleanor," Clara said softly, looking down at the perfect sleeping face. "Eleanor Grace Winslow." She gave the baby her maiden name. Vance Sterling was entirely erased from the birth certificate. Dust. He was erased from their future. As Clara held Eleanor, a profound, heavy sense of peace washed over her entire body. Layer after layer of trauma, fear, and insecurity simply dissolved into the sunlit air. She thought about Vance one final time. She did not feel a single drop of anger. She did not feel the need for revenge. The opposite of love was not hate. The absolute opposite of love was apathy. And Clara was completely apathetic toward him. Through Bridget's network, Clara knew exactly where Vance was. He was not living in a luxury penthouse. He was currently living in a cheap, roadside motel out on Route 9. His passport had been confiscated by federal authorities pending the massive corporate fraud and embezzlement trial. He was facing up to 10 years in federal prison. Peyton had vanished completely. The moment the federal agents showed up at the corporate office, she had packed her desk and fled. She was rumored to be working as a receptionist at a minor dental clinic in a different state, pretending she had never even met the disgraced billionaire. Vance was entirely alone. He was tied up in endless litigation. He spent his days drinking cheap liquor and pacing the worn, stained carpet of a two-star motel room. The empire he thought he built had crushed him the second it collapsed. But Clara did not dwell on his misery. His misery was his own consequence. It had nothing to do with her anymore. 4 days later, Clara brought Eleanor home. The house felt completely different. It was no longer a cold, perfectly staged museum designed to impress corporate investors. The dark suits were gone. The expensive scotch was gone. The heavy, suffocating tension was gone. The house was bright. It was messy. It was filled with the soft sounds of a baby breathing and the smell of warm milk. It was finally a home. Clara's father had stayed for the first week, fixing squeaky doors and cooking massive breakfasts. Bridget visited every evening, dropping off legal updates and massive boxes of expensive baby clothes. Clara was entirely supported. She was entirely safe. On a quiet Tuesday morning, a month after Eleanor was born, Clara woke up early. The sun was just beginning to rise, painting the sky in deep streaks of orange and violet. The house was perfectly still. Clara walked into the nursery. Eleanor was sleeping soundly in her white wooden crib, her tiny chest rising and falling in a steady, peaceful rhythm. Clara smiled. She pulled the soft green blanket a little higher over the baby's shoulders. She walked downstairs to the kitchen, the new kitchen. She had paid contractors to replace the dark marble island and the cold Italian tile. The space was now warm with natural oak floors and soft white countertops. The broken glass and the spilled batter were nothing but a distant memory. Clara made a fresh pot of decaf coffee. The rich, earthy smell filled the room. She poured the dark liquid into a heavy ceramic mug. She added a generous splash of sweet cream. She unlocked the back door and stepped out onto the large wooden porch. The morning air was crisp and cool. The dew was still heavy on the manicured grass. Clara sat down in a large, comfortable wicker chair. She pulled her thick-knit cardigan tight around her shoulders. She took a slow sip of her coffee. The warmth spread down her throat and settled in her chest. She did not bring her phone outside. She did not have the urge to check anyone's location. She did not have the urge to scroll through text messages. She just sat there, drinking a cup of coffee on the porch, simply watching the wind blow through the leaves of the massive oak tree in the center of the yard. Unrushed, untethered, completely present. She looked down at her left hand resting on the arm of the wicker chair. The heavy vintage sapphire ring gleamed in the early morning light. The deep blue stone was beautiful. It no longer represented betrayal. It represented endurance. It represented the long line of strong women in her family who had survived far worse things than a weak man. As the wind brushed against her face, a quiet, undeniable truth settled into Clara's mind. She finally understood that he didn't break her. He just cleared the space for her to rebuild. For years, she had contorted herself to fit perfectly inside the tiny box he had built for her. She had silenced her own voice so he could speak louder. She had dimmed her own light so he could shine brighter. She had thought losing him would be the end of her world. But starting over did not mean she was behind. Starting over meant she was finally free to walk on her own path. She had faced the absolute darkest corners of betrayal. She had been stripped of her dignity, mocked in her most vulnerable state, and pushed to the absolute edge of her sanity. But she did not fall. She learned how to fly. Clara took another sip of her coffee. Inside the house, a soft, high-pitched cry echoed through the baby monitor resting on the table next to her. Eleanor was waking up. The day was officially beginning. Clara did not feel exhausted. She did not feel dread. She felt a profound, electric spark of joy. Tussed. She stood up from the wicker chair. She took one last look at the beautiful, bright morning sky. She turned around and walked back inside the warm, safe house. She had a daughter to raise. She had a life to live. And for the first time in 7 years, Clara Winslow was exactly where she belonged. The nightmare was over. Her beautiful reality had just begun.
Thank you for staying with Clara until the very final moments of today's story. As the noise of the grand ballroom fades away and as Vance Sterling's glittering, fake aura completely collapses, what remains in the room isn't the petty satisfaction of revenge. Instead, it is a profound, quiet space for us to reflect on the true value of love, loyalty, and human nature. The greatest lesson this story leaves behind is the undeniable reality of karma and the importance of never forgetting your roots. Vance represents a certain kind of person, those who, upon reaching the peak of success, conveniently forget their days of struggle. He forgot the woman who worked double shifts at a hospital just to keep the lights on in their freezing apartment. He believed that money and status could buy everything, to the point where he turned his devoted, pregnant wife into a mere corporate prop. But life has a very fair way of balancing the scales. If you build your empire on a foundation of lies, and if you construct your house on someone else's land, sooner or later, you will have to pay the price. And that price is absolute, crushing emptiness. A massive pillar of strength in this story is the image of Clara's father, a hidden billionaire, who chose to show up in a faded denim shirt. He stands as a symbol of enduring core values: humility, unconditional love, and the fierce protection of family. He let his son-in-law pay for dinners. He calmly accepted being looked down upon not because he was weak, but because he wanted to see the true character of the man standing next to his daughter. It's a powerful reminder for all of us. A person's true worth is never measured by the luxury car they drive, the tailored suit they wear, or the polished words they speak. It is measured entirely by how they treat those they believe are beneath them. Finally, Clara's journey redefines the true meaning of empowerment. Her silence from the moment she read those devastating messages to the moment she faced her husband was never about submission. It was a masterclass in rational, calculated maturity. She didn't choose a loud, messy confrontation. She didn't compromise her dignity in a fit of rage. Instead, she took a step back, picked up her broken pieces, and crafted a bulletproof plan to protect her unborn child's future. The moment Clara walked out of that toxic marriage, carrying her grandmother's sapphire ring in her pocket, she reclaimed her soul. Her absolute apathy at the end of the story is the highest form of liberation.